Have you ever been enjoying a piece of media and seen a particular power that baffled you? Something that feels like it shouldn't work but is so damn satisfying that you almost forget it's unusual in the first place? A seemingly useless ability that then shocks you with a unique application you never expected. Something a little weird. So, weird powers. Seems simple at first, right? But maybe not. After all, the concept of someone having powers by itself is kinda weird in the first place, if you think about it. And what are powers anyway? To the average fan of fictional media, it may seem obvious, but there's a bunch of arguments you can make for what should and shouldn't be defined as power. And while I think it's maybe a little counterproductive to get lost in the weeds like that, I still want to make it super clear what my definition is for the sake of clarity. So again, I ask, what are powers? For the sake of this video, I'm considering powers as supernatural abilities, unnatural physical, spiritual, or mental aspects, peak physical condition, and anything that would put them above the normal person, basically. In this case, I'm also counting being really smart or other weird borderline supernatural abilities, either obtained at birth or by training really hard, as powers, so long as the media treats them as such. And this does include stuff that would be considered normal in universe, but supernatural in real life. Think bending from The Last Airbender. Got it? Great, let's move on. So, before I argue the importance of weird powers, I want to make a point of why you should care about them in the first place. Well, any story based around characters with supernatural abilities will naturally be warped by how they're implemented. Even if they aren't the main focus of the narrative, the addition of a supernatural or fantastic element will alter how the story feels, and the way the characters interact with this element tend to define the kind of story you're telling. In essence, powers, when introduced to a story or character, become a character in their own right. They help shape the narrative and the world just as much as any other character would, maybe even more. They're versatile too, an incredibly useful tool for someone building their own world. How seriously you take powers in-universe can define stakes or set tone. Powers can also be symbolic, or simply just a fun way to drive the story forwards. A narrative vehicle for the plot, so to speak. Fun, right? Then let's get into how you can take your powers and spin them to make things a little more interesting, huh? But maybe I'm getting a little ahead of myself. After all, what's weird mean anyway? Well, first, put as simply as possible, normal powers are just powers with simple conditions and simple applications. Just very straightforward capabilities you could describe in a single sentence, for the most part. This usually includes stuff like super strength, super speed, shooting generic energy or fire, flight, telekinesis, etc. etc. Normal powers don't tend to have any strange requirements or huge side effects the user has to work around. Of course, this doesn't necessarily mean that they don't have downsides. Most well-written normal powers do have some form of downside or weakness, such as having to be very careful with their strength, being unable to use them in crowded areas, or an increased sensitivity to certain senses. That being said, again, powers by their nature are not normal. In this case, normal is more of a catch-all term for anything that doesn't do anything particularly strange or unusual. Realistically, this is a bit of an oversimplification. In reality, normal to weird is probably more of a spectrum, depending on a number of factors. Here's a chart I made that I feel like would be a good way to sort it out. But let's just keep things simple. And speaking of simple, Yes, that's right. Normal powers are great. I love a simple power done well. There's a ton of benefits to using simple powers in your story or characters. If you want to tell an incredibly character-driven story, simple powers may well be your best option. You don't want the power system to overshadow the complex relationships and dynamics. After all, it's generally easier to focus on the personal and emotional aspects of media when the fantastical elements are simple and easy to understand. Additionally, it can appeal to a broader audience. There's many people out there that may be turned off from your story if they have to study a new fantasy periodic table before they can properly understand what's going on. Though ultimately you should aim for a balance you feel comfortable with. If you make something you love, people will feel it too. And finally, simple or normal powers used in fun ways may allow for interesting extrapolations and subversions of usual tropes and conventions. Maybe even to the point of becoming weird powers themselves. We'll touch on this again later. But so finally, what about weird powers? What are they? Well, weird powers are complex powers with complex conditions. Abstract powers with strange applications. Capabilities with harsh limits. The sort of thing that perhaps wouldn't immediately jump to mind when you think powers. You know, weird stuff. Weird powers usually require a decent amount of thought or practice to use well. They often take the form of unconventional or abstract powers that might not usually be considered useful by most people. Like, for example, a power that allows its user to swap any two fruits they've touched within the last 3 days. Very cool, very threatening. So, we know what weird powers are, but what makes them better? Well, firstly, when used well, weird powers can make for more memorable and interesting scenes, be they action, fights, political intrigue, mystery, you name it. Having complex interworking elements forcing the characters to work around a set of limitations naturally incentivizes interesting conflict and resolutions. Watching the journey of a character who has to work to make their powers useful, watching them come up with creative usages or training in specific ways is just far more satisfying from a narrative point of view than just punch harder plotlines. The aha moment that comes when a character finally pulls out their special move that they've trained themselves for, or the little trick that they've figured out with their powers. That can be immensely satisfying for a viewer, and also for a writer. Like, for example, the aforementioned fruit swapping ability. What if they ended up in a situation later in their story where they're facing off against an antagonist? They've worked hard, but the antagonist looks down on them, brushing off their powers as nothing. Until they swap the grapes in their utility belt with the various fruit weapons they painstakingly made at home. Suddenly they can pull out any tool for the job. Any weapon, so long as they've prepared it in advance. Sounds pretty useful to me. In a way, it parallels the very human experience of finding your own strengths and working to improve yourself in a way that works for you. Something that works for one person isn't necessarily going to work for another. It's just human nature. When powers have a hard limit that can only be overcome by thinking outside the box or using the power in a creative way, they can assist the author with pacing or stakes. Of course, someone stuck with a weird power who tries their absolute hardest to use it in the most normal way possible, or even someone who rejects the power altogether, can make for a powerful narrative. It's all up to how you execute it. There's some other advantages to weird powers too. Weird powers can act better as allegories for real-world struggles or philosophical ideas. It can convey ideas or express what it feels like to live with certain conditions or mental illness by translating it into easier to understand concepts. The human mind is weird. Life is weird. What better to represent them than powers that are just as weird? As a general side note, weird powers are limited by the writer. When it comes down to it, writing around weird powers can be quite a lot, so if you're just starting out, it might be best to just keep it simple. Having to work around a laundry list of activation conditions can make writing a big hassle. But there's one more point I'd like to make. Coming up with unique powers and how they can shape your characters could be a lot of fun. Like, how does someone with the power to bring objects to life while they're touching them interact with the world? How do they feel about recycling and disposable objects? How would being able to see ghosts affect a child? Do they hide it? Do they treat death any differently? Do they neglect studies because the ghosts help them cheat? Asking these kinds of questions can lead you down some fun paths, helping you come up with not just a weird power, but a weird person that grew up alongside them. And this can apply to D&D characters too. Working with your GM to get weird with a typical character concept can make for an extremely memorable campaign. As an example, a character I made but never ended up using was a warlock who was raised by a pack of intelligent blink dogs, and his patron was his mother. In order to keep his overbearing wolf mom appeased, he'd have to bury a bone in the ground each day of Fable, to show he can hunt enough prey for himself, and also as a snack for her. This turns the menacing relationship between patron and warlock into one of awkward appeasement and overbearing parental guidance. Asking a favor from your patron, instead of being a dance of avoiding being taken advantage of or tricked, becomes having to convince your parent that they aren't spoiling you, or that you are independent, but you just need a hand. The possibilities are endless once you're willing to get a bit weird with it. What about a buff wizard raised by barbarians who studied in secret then ran away to follow their dreams of magic? A sorcerer that's cursed with a wild magic parasite after littering at the entrance to the Feywilds. A monk that believes they achieved enlightenment after getting pranked by some adventurers using illusion spells, while incredibly drunk. So basically, letting yourself get a little weird with your writing can lead to a whole lot of fun. Now, a couple notes that didn't fit anywhere else. You may recall before I mentioned normal powers becoming weird if stretched far enough. Well, that is a very real way to use simple powers, and it's also extremely satisfying. Probably one of the best examples of this comes from HunterXHunter, which is the very epitome of a power system built around limits. And more specifically, a character called Hisoka. Hisoka's ability, which is called Bungee Gum, is very simple. You see, it has the properties of both rubber and gum. Can you believe it, folks? Rubber and gum. Incredible. Yeah, at first glance this may seem rather underwhelming, but very quickly Hisoka shows the audience why this should be taken seriously. When used creatively, Bungee Gum is incredibly useful and incredibly deadly. Now I'll try to be as vague as possible with these, but some examples of Bungee Gum in action include catching projectiles faster than bullets and sending them back, attaching it to objects and using them as flails, or manipulating objects from afar by attaching a thin strand and pulling it, attaching it to his feet to stand on and walk up walls, sticking people in place, and the list goes on. I think Bungee Gum has earned its place as an honorary weird power, and shines as an example that, with enough creativity, even simple powers can evolve into something truly unique. With all this said though, ultimately the powers and power systems should complement the story you want to tell, the character you want to create. Just pick up the pen and write something. The hardest part is starting. But weird powers are better, and normal powers suck.